Hi, I'm Ross Mayfield, investment strategy analyst at Baird, and we are back for another weekly video with our friends at Strategas. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Washington research analyst Jeannette Lowe. Jeannette, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Ross. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for asking. It's great to have you here. Very fortuitous timing. Obviously, all eyes are on Russia, Ukraine right now. And there are a lot of downstream implications from the turmoil there, one of which is U.S. energy policy. We're recording on a Wednesday. It was very recently announced that the U.S. would be banning energy imports from Russia, oil, natural gas, and so on. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What does it mean for U.S. energy policy going forward? What are the implications? And what does it mean for U.S. energy independence down the road?
Absolutely. So this is kind of important because if we kind of looked at what the sanctions regime theories were coming out of both the US and Europe when this war originally started, it was all about not going after the energy sector with Russia, because we knew that the European economy is quite dependent on Russia for its energy. And so there was concern about taking sanctions to that level because of the domestic pain that it would then put on Europeans and even Americans to some extent, and that not having the pain be felt by the people who are kind of defending Ukraine, but having it more felt by the Russian economy. So obviously the war keeps evolving, keeps getting worse. Civilians are now being targeted. So there's been a desire to step up that. And you've had a lot of members of Congress, bipartisan support for this to have a ban on the US side of any Russian oil, gas, energy products, any of those things. And then that kind of really, the White House again was kind of opposed to that in the beginning because it would have this negative impact. And you saw them change their tune this week with that announcement being made. Uh, the Biden administration is still going to be concerned about what does happen to oil prices in the US and gas prices. And so that is still going to be a concern domestically. And that's why he's going to try to alert the American people that this is going to be happening, and talking about trying to transition to renewables and things like that as we go forward. But it is kind of a very big important step because it's showing that the war is not ending with the sanctions that have been in place. And there is definitely this feel amongst the US and even the Europeans, even though they know they can't do it right away, to ultimately transition away from Russian energy. And so I think that that's the kind of the bigger trend that we're starting to see here.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think if you're the US in this situation you find yourself in now, it makes a lot of sense to start to think about that. So that bears the next question, which is what are the steps? What does a more energy independent US look like? Is it focusing on some of the climate spending that was in the Build Back Better bill? Is it passing laws to incentivize domestic producers to drill more? There are a lot of ways we can go here, but I'm curious what you think. What does a U.S. that's less dependent on foreign oil and foreign energy look like going forward?
Yeah, and so the one thing obviously to remember is that the US is not very dependent on Russian oil at all. It's a very small percentage of what the US actually imports, and it kind of has actually been in place because it was supplementing Venezuelan oil. But that being said, there is obviously this push in the US to talk about let's move to more of renewables, so that we're getting off fossil fuels in general. There's also a talk about, could we increase domestic production? And there's talk about, you see US officials going to Venezuela, potentially thinking about getting some of their oil back on the market. Maybe do we get a deal with Iran? Do we get some of the Iranian oil back on the market? That I think is more, at least for the administration, partially a short-term fix. And also maybe to potentially say we don't necessarily want to have too much increased production domestically. But there's probably going to have to be a balance between, how quickly can you actually transition to renewables, especially for other parts of the world. And if the US is looking to, maybe provide our LNG exports to Europe to make sure that they don't have to be as dependent on Russia, that's going to be showing that fossil fuels have to be part of the mix. So you kind of saw the administration talking this week about saying that they really want to have this transition to renewables, but also saying, that there are permits out there that could still have domestic production. So I think they're trying to hedge their message a bit because they've been so focused on this climate piece. But what does that look like going forward? We did see in the Build Back Better a big climate change portion of that, all about incentives to incentivize renewable energy, a lot of climate spending, things for resiliency to kind of put some money out there to also foster some changes. That I think has a chance to really kind of still come forward as a legislative piece. There's two options here. They could either do a partisan bill like Build Back Better was going to be, kind of pass all these measures on their own as just the Democratic Party, or they could do a bipartisan bill where they would take some of these tax incentives that would try to incentivize the use of renewable energy and tie that with maybe some easing of permitting for fossil fuels, or maybe lifting one of the bans on offshore drilling, things like that. So I think there's an option here. And what's going to have to happen is that the White House and members of Congress are going to kind of have to come together and say, what can we support on both sides, where we can actually support the renewable energy side, but at the same time, we realize that we can't make the transition that quickly, nor can our US allies. And so we're going to have fossil fuels as part of the mix.
Yeah, it's a narrow line to walk, but it makes a ton of sense. And I want to thank you so much for your expertise and your time today. This is obviously a very fluid and evolving situation, but I think this is a great primer on how U.S. investors can think about energy going forward. And we'll be sure to talk to you again soon as things develop. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate it.